Hello, listener. It's 3:42 p.m. in Yellowstone National Park. Old Faithful just erupted 6 minutes ago to an audience of approximately 4,000 people who came to watch the most predictable geyser in the world do exactly what it does every 90 minutes. Right now, those 4,000 people are standing on wooden boardwalks surrounded by geothermal features that could boil them, alive if they stepped off the path. And they're taking photographs and buying souvenirs and asking park rangers questions about bison and geysers and whether the supervolcano underneath their feet is going to erupt anytime soon. The supervolcano isn't the problem today. Something else is. My name is David Morgan. I'm broadcasting on 91.3 FM KYEL out of Bozeman, Montana, which is the closest city to Yellowstone that has actual radio infrastructure. We reach most of the park on clear days, and all of Montana and Wyoming when atmospheric conditions cooperate. Normally, at 3:42 p.m. on a Saturday in July, I'd be playing classic rock for people driving to camping trips or coming back from them. Today I'm not playing music because 17 minutes ago, I received a call from a Yellowstone park ranger that made me understand immediately that this was not a normal Saturday in the park. Here's what I know. At approximately 3:11 p.m., a bull bison attacked a tourist near the Old Faithful viewing area. This is not unprecedented. Bison attack several tourists per year in Yellowstone, usually because the tourists got too close for photographs, or because they didn't understand that a 2,000-pound animal that looks placid is actually capable of running 35 miles per hour and trampling you. The park has extensive warning signage. People ignore it anyway. What made this attack different is what the bison did after the initial contact. According to the ranger who called me, Ranger Sarah Whitmore, the bison didn't charge once and leave. It pinned the tourist to the ground and bit him. Bison are grazers. They have flat teeth designed for eating grass. They do not bite humans as an attack behavior because they don't have the dentition for it. Except this one did. At 3:14 p.m., the tourist who was bitten began showing symptoms. High fever that came on within 3 minutes. Behavioral changes that escalated from confusion to aggression. By 3:18 p.m., the tourist attacked 2 other visitors who had been trying to help him. He bit both of them. At 3:25 p.m., Sarah Whitmore called me because she's been listening to reports from other parks and other outbreaks, and she understood what she was looking at before her chain of command did. And she made the decision that getting information to the public faster than official channels could provide it was more important than following protocol. Sarah Whitmore is 28 years old, has been a Yellowstone ranger for 4 years, and just made the kind of career-ending decision that might save hundreds of lives. I'm on the air because Sarah called me and said, "David, we have an outbreak in the park, and we have 4,000 people at Old Faithful right now, and they don't know yet, and someone needs to tell them before they figure it out the hard way." At 3:27 p.m., Yellowstone National Park contains approximately 12,000 visitors. That's a relatively low day for July, which can see peaks of 20,000 or more. But 12,000 people is still 12,000 people distributed across 2.2 million acres of wilderness, with 5 entrance gates and 1 main road loop that takes approximately 4 hours to drive in its entirety. 12,000 people in a park where cell service is limited, where the nearest hospital is in Bozeman 60 miles north of the park boundary, where emergency response means park rangers and limited EA's resources and nothing that resembles the infrastructure of a city. At 3:29 p.m., my producer tonight is Marcus Reed. Marcus is 34 years old, grew up in Livingston, Montana, knows Yellowstone the way people who grew up near it know Yellowstone, which is to say, he understands that the park is not a zoo, and the animals are not tame, and the geothermal features are not decorations, and the isolation is real. Marcus showed up at 3:32 p.m. when he heard the broadcast beginning, because he understood immediately what Yellowstone plus Outbreak meant, and he knew I was going to need someone running communications while I talked. Marcus is pulling park maps right now. He's got the Yellowstone Ranger radio frequency on one scanner and the Park County Sheriff on another scanner and the Montana Highway Patrol on a third. He's building a picture of what's happening across the park using every source available and writing notes on a whiteboard that he brought from his truck because Marcus Reed is the kind of person who keeps a whiteboard in his truck. At 3:34 p.m., Sarah called back. The situation at Old Faithful has escalated in the 7 minutes since her first call. The tourist who was bitten by the bison has now attacked 6 people total. 3 of those 6 are showing symptoms. The bison that initiated the attack is still in the area, still behaving erratically, and according to Sarah, is now moving toward the Old Faithful Inn, which is the historic lodge adjacent to the geyser, and which currently has approximately 800 guests checked in, and another 300 people in the dining room and gift shop. I asked Sarah, "What's the containment plan?" She said, "We don't have one yet. Park leadership is still trying to understand what we're dealing with, and they're following protocols designed for bear attacks or medical emergencies. Not this. I'm at the scene with 2 other rangers, and we're trying to establish a perimeter around the affected area, but we have 4,000 people and 3 rangers and no backup yet, because the nearest other ranger station is at Madison Junction 20 miles away. At 3:37 p.m., I need every person in Yellowstone National Park right now to hear me clearly. If you are at Old Faithful or the surrounding area, you need to get inside a building immediately. Not your car. A building. The Old Faithful Inn, the Snow Lodge, the Visitor Center. Any structure with solid walls and doors that lock. If you are elsewhere in the park, you need to stay exactly where you are and monitor this frequency for updates, because the situation at Old Faithful is not contained, and we don't yet know the extent of spread. At 3:39 p.m., Marcus handed me a note. It says, "Mammoth Hot Springs reports incident 45 minutes ago. Wildlife attack. Victim showing symptoms. North end of park. Mammoth Hot Springs is 50 miles from Old Faithful. If we have incidents at both ends of the park, this didn't start at Old Faithful. It started somewhere else and spread before anyone recognized what it was." At 3:41 p.m., I'm going to tell you something about Yellowstone that you need to understand before I tell you anything else. Because if you're not familiar with this park, you won't comprehend the geography we're facing. Yellowstone sits on top of a supervolcano. That's not metaphor. Beneath the park is a magma chamber, so large that if it erupted, it would cover half the United States in ash and trigger a volcanic winter that could last years. The park exists because of that volcanic activity, which produces the geysers and hot springs and mud pots, and all the geothermal features that make Yellowstone unique. That volcanic activity also produces a landscape that is beautiful and deadly in ways that most national parks are not. There are acidic pools hot enough to dissolve a human body. There are geysers that erupt with no warning. There are thermal features everywhere that will kill you if you step off the boardwalk. The park is not a playground. It's a wilderness preserve sitting on top of one of the most geologically active regions on the planet. And right now, 12,000 people are in that wilderness with something that spreads through bites and shows no response to pain and moves from host to host in under 30 minutes. At 3:44 p.m., the Park County Sheriff's Office issued an advisory that I'm going to read exactly as they transmitted it, because it represents the first official acknowledgement that this is happening. The advisory said, Park County Sheriff's Office is responding to reports of violent incidents at Yellowstone National Park. Visitors are advised to secure in place and await direction from park rangers. Do not attempt to exit the park until given clearance. Monitor emergency broadcasts for updates. Do not attempt to exit the park. That's the critical piece. The roads in Yellowstone are narrow, winding, 2-lane routes through wilderness with limited pullouts and no shoulders and wildlife that walks onto the road without warning. If 12,000 people try to evacuate simultaneously, we're going to have gridlock in the park with nowhere to go and no way to manage it. The rangers know this. The sheriff knows this. That's why the advisory says stay in place. At 3:47 p.m., Sarah called in again. Her voice had changed. Not panicked, but harder, the way voices get when people have stopped hoping for a good outcome and started managing for the least bad one. She said, "David, the bison has reached the Old Faithful Inn. It's trying to get through the main entrance doors. The doors are holding, but we have approximately 800 people in that building. And if the bison breaches, or if any of the infected humans reach the building, we have a containment failure in the largest lodging structure in the park." I asked, "What are your options?" She said, "We have one ranger with a rifle. We have doors that weren't designed to be defensible. We have 800 civilians who came here to see geysers. Those are my options." At 3:49 p.m., I broadcast Sarah's situation and added my own analysis, because sometimes what people need is not just information, but context for what the information means. The Old Faithful Inn is a historic wooden structure built in 1903. It's beautiful. It's architecturally significant. It's also made of logs and has large windows, and was designed to be welcoming to tourists, not secure against threats. If that building needs to serve as a fortress tonight, it's going to be a fortress with significant vulnerabilities. At 3:52 p.m., Marcus got through to the Mammoth Hot Springs Ranger Station and put them on speaker. The ranger who answered, Daniel Hayes, confirmed an incident at approximately 2:55 p.m. involving a cow elk that attacked a hiker on the Beaver Ponds Trail. The hiker was bitten, showed rapid symptom progression, and attacked 2 other hikers on the trail. All 3 are currently in unknown locations in the backcountry. Rangers have been searching, but the Beaver Ponds Trail is 5 miles long and goes through heavy timber, and they have 3 people who might be infected somewhere in that area. Daniel said, "We didn't connect it to anything. We thought it was an isolated animal attack until we started hearing the radio traffic from Old Faithful. 2 wildlife attacks. 2 different species. 2 different locations 50 miles apart. This isn't random animal aggression. This is infection in the wildlife population spreading to humans through contact." At 3:55 p.m., I need to ask something directly to the researchers and veterinarians, and anyone listening who has expertise in wildlife disease. If this prion-based pathogen has jumped to Yellowstone's wildlife population, and if it's present in bison and elk, and potentially other species, the scope of this problem is different from any urban outbreak. Yellowstone has approximately 5,000 bison, 10,000 elk. The park's entire ecosystem could be a reservoir for this infection, and every human-wildlife interaction becomes a potential exposure event. At 3:57 p.m., Sarah's voice came over the radio with the update I'd been waiting for and dreading simultaneously. She said, "The bison breached the doors. Stay on this frequency, because Yellowstone just became the most dangerous national park in America." The bison breached the Old Faithful Inn's main entrance at 3:58 p.m. by the simple method of being a 2,000-pound animal hitting wooden doors that were built in 1903 and were never designed to stop a 2,000-pound animal. Sarah said the doors held for approximately 90 seconds of the bison, ramming them before the frame gave way, and the animal entered the lobby. What happened in the next 4 minutes is what happens when panicked crowds encounter unexpected danger in a confined space. The 800 people in the Old Faithful Inn were distributed between the lobby, the dining room, the gift shop, and the upper floor balconies. When the bison entered the lobby, the people nearest to it scattered in every direction available, which meant some went up the stairs to the upper floors. Some went deeper into the building toward the dining room and guest room corridors, and some went toward the side exits and back exits and any opening that wasn't the main entrance, where a bison was currently destroying a historic wooden lobby. Sarah and 2 other rangers were trying to manage the bison and the crowd simultaneously. which is approximately 3 impossible things happening at once. At 4:01 p.m., Sarah reported that the bison had been subdued through lethal force by the ranger with the rifle. But in the 4 minutes between breach and neutralization, the infected tourists had entered the building through the broken doors and were now somewhere in the structure with 800 people. At 4:03 p.m., Marcus showed me the park map and pointed at Old Faithful with one hand and Mammoth with the other. He said, "If we have 2 confirmed outbreak points 50 miles apart, we have to assume there are incidents in the areas between them. The Grand Loop Road connects every major feature in the park: Canyon Village, Norris, Madison Junction, Tower Roosevelt. Every one of those junctions has visitor facilities and tourists." I broadcast that immediately because the people at those locations needed to know before they learned it by discovering infected individuals in their vicinity. If you are at Canyon Village, at Norris, at Madison Junction, at any of the developed areas in Yellowstone National Park, assume that the outbreak is not limited to Old Faithful and Mammoth. Secure your position. Do not travel on park roads unless absolutely necessary. At 4:06 p.m., the first call came in from outside the park. A woman named Jennifer Collins, calling from West Yellowstone, Montana, which is the town immediately outside the park's west entrance. Jennifer works at a hotel in West Yellowstone that caters to park visitors, and she called because several guests had checked in around 3 p.m. showing symptoms that she now realizes match what I've been describing: high fever, confusion, increasing aggression. She said, "David, they came from the park. They were in the park this morning, and they came back to the hotel around 3, and they weren't okay, and we thought it was heat exhaustion or altitude sickness, but now I'm listening to you, and I think it was something else." At 4:09 p.m., West Yellowstone has a population of approximately 1,300 permanent residents, and during summer tourist season that population swells with workers and visitors to several thousand. If infected individuals from the park reached West Yellowstone before anyone understood what they were carrying, we have outbreak conditions in a Montana town in addition to the outbreak in the park itself. At 4:11 p.m., I received the call I'd been expecting from someone I'd hoped wouldn't need to call. Dr. Rachel Kim, emergency medicine physician at Bozeman Health Deaconess Hospital, which is the primary hospital serving the Yellowstone region. Dr. Kim called because 3 patients had arrived from the park via private vehicle in the past 30 minutes, all showing rapid symptom progression after wildlife attacks, all violent, all requiring full restraint protocols. And Dr. Kim wanted to know if I had any information about what she was treating, because her patients weren't responding to any standard interventions. I told her everything I knew: prion-based pathogen, bite transmission, 20 to 30-minute progression timeline, no effective treatment once symptoms begin, only possible mitigation through immediate aggressive wound decontamination. Dr. Kim listened without interrupting, and then said, "David, if people are driving themselves from the park to Bozeman after being bitten, they're on the road for the hour between exposure and transition. Some of them are going to transition while driving. We're going to have vehicle accidents on Highway 191 between the park and the city." At 4:14 p.m., I broadcast an immediate warning for Highway 191, the main route between Yellowstone's north entrance and Bozeman. If you are on that highway right now, drive with extreme caution. Be prepared for erratic vehicle behavior. Do not stop for stranded vehicles without assessing the situation from a safe distance. If you were bitten in the park and you're driving to Bozeman for treatment, pull over immediately and call 911 before you transition behind the wheel. At 4:17 p.m., Marcus got confirmation from the Park Service that they were implementing full park closure. All entrance gates closing immediately. No new vehicles allowed in. No vehicles allowed out until coordinated evacuation procedures could be established. Yellowstone National Park, which sees an average of 100,000 visitors per day in July, was now closed for the first time since the 1988 fires, and this time The closure wasn't to keep people out. It was to keep them from leaving in an uncontrolled manner that would spread the infection beyond the park boundaries. At 4:19 p.m., I want to take a moment to address something that I haven't said explicitly yet, but which needs to be said. If you are in Yellowstone National Park right now, and you're listening to this broadcast, and you're thinking about getting in your car and driving out before the official evacuation procedures are established, I need you to understand what you'd be doing. You'd be risking your life on narrow park roads that are about to become gridlocked with other people making the same decision. You'd be potentially carrying infection out of the park to communities that don't have it yet. And you'd be making it harder for the people who are trying to organize a safe evacuation for everyone. Stay where you are. Secure your position. Wait for coordinated response. At 4:22 p.m., Sarah updated from Old Faithful. The inn had been sectioned by the rangers, using furniture and doors and whatever was available to create separate zones. Approximately 500 people had been secured in the upper floor guest room areas, which were accessible by stairs and had solid doors that could be locked from inside. Approximately 300 people were in various locations throughout the lower level, some secured in the dining room, some in back corridors, some in unknown positions. The infected individuals, both human and the now deceased bison, were on the lower level in locations that rangers were trying to track through reports from people hiding in rooms and calling ranger dispatch on hotel phones. Sarah said, "We're doing building clearing with 3 rangers and inadequate equipment. This is not what we train for." At 4:25 p.m., the Wyoming National Guard was activated by the governor. Initial deployment targeting Jackson Hole, which is approximately 60 miles south of the park and has airport infrastructure that can receive military aircraft. Timeline for Guard units actually reaching the park, 2 to 3 hours minimum. In 2 to 3 hours, using the 20 to 30 minute progression timeline and assuming conservative transmission rates, the math gets significantly worse than it currently is. At 4:28 p.m., I'm going to do something that Marcus has been telling me I need to do since this broadcast started, which is acknowledge that this frequency exists because people in Montana and Wyoming need local voices during crisis. Kyle 91.3 is a Bozeman station that serves the region including Yellowstone, and we exist because the geography out here is vast and the populations are small and the big networks don't always cover what matters to people in places like this. If this broadcast is helping you right now, if you're in the park or in West Yellowstone or on Highway 191 or anywhere in the Yellowstone region, and this frequency is giving you information faster than you'd get it otherwise, then you're seeing what local radio does. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're watching this later. Tell us in the comments where you are right now, what part of the park you're in, what you're seeing. And if you want to support what we do, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. Marcus and I are going to be here as long as Yellowstone needs us to be here. Support local radio, because this is exactly what it's for. At 4:31 p.m., the first report of wildlife infection beyond bison and elk came in from a ranger at Canyon Village. A black bear, showing the same erratic aggressive behavior, had attacked a photographer on one of the canyon rim trails. The photographer was bitten and was showing symptoms. The bear was still in the area and had approached the canyon lodge, which has approximately 600 guests. Bears, bison, elk, the infection is in multiple species, which means the reservoir is not a single population that can be contained. It's distributed across Yellowstone's entire wildlife ecosystem, which contains 67 mammal species and approximately 200,000 large mammals total. At 4:34 p.m., Marcus had been on the phone with Yellowstone Rangers while I broadcast, and he came over to give me something that he said needed to go on the air immediately. He said, "David, the Park Service is organizing lodging consolidation. They're moving people from vulnerable positions to the most defensible structures in each area of the park. Old Faithful Inn, despite the breach, is still more defensible than other options in that area. Canyon Lodge, Lake Hotel. They're treating this like a siege scenario and trying to get everyone into fortified positions before full dark. Full dark in Yellowstone in July is approximately 9 p.m. We had 4.5 hours of daylight remaining. 4.5 hours to consolidate 12,000 people from campsites and pullouts and trailheads, parking lots into buildings that were designed for hospitality, not defense. At 4:37 p.m., I took a call from a man named Robert Finch, who is currently in his RV at the Madison Junction campground with his wife and 2 teenage sons. Robert said, "We heard the park closure announcement on CB radio. We're at our campsite, and we can see other campers packing up and trying to leave despite the closure order." He said, "I'm a retired military officer, and I know what happens when people panic and ignore orders. It gets people killed. What should I be doing?" I said, "Robert, how defensible is your RV?" He said, "It's a 32-foot Class A solid doors. Good locks. Generator for climate control. I've got food and water for 4 days at least." I said, "Then you're in a better position than most people in this park. Stay in your RV. Lock the doors. Monitor information. Don't try to drive out. Your RV is a fortress if you treat it like one," he said. "Copy that." Then he said, "Can you keep broadcasting? My sons need to hear a voice that sounds like someone's in control of something." "I'm broadcasting, Robert, as long as you need me to." At 4:40 p.m., the temperature in Yellowstone was 82 degrees and dropping. Summer days in the park can be warm, but nights are cold, even in July, because of the elevation. The overnight low was forecast for 48 degrees. I'm mentioning this because Marcus and I have been discussing what temperature does to the infected, based on data from other outbreaks, and the question is whether Yellowstone's cold nights will help suppress infection like Alaska's extreme cold did, or whether the temperature range won't be low enough to make a difference. At 4:43 p.m., Dr. Kim called back from Bozeman with updated medical information. She said, "David, I've treated 7 patients now from the park. All wildlife bites. All showed the same rapid progression. 4 of them died before we could even establish treatment. 3 are in restraint and showing full acute symptoms." She said, "And I need to tell you something else. 2 of our staff members were bitten during patient restraint before we understood what we were dealing with. Both are showing symptoms. We've isolated them, but this is now inside Bozeman Health. The hospital's 60 miles from Yellowstone. The primary medical facility for the entire region has infected staff. Every person who goes to that hospital for treatment is now potentially at risk, and every person who was at that hospital in the past hour and had contact with those 2 staff members is potentially exposed." At 4:46 p.m., Marcus handed me another note. It said, "Gardner incident, North Entrance Town. Multiple reports." Gardner, Montana, is the town at Yellowstone's north entrance. Population 800. The only year-round entrance to the park. If Gardner has infected, we have 3 gateway communities compromised: West Yellowstone, Gardner, and Bozeman's hospital. The outbreak is not contained to the park anymore. It's in Montana. At 4:49 p.m., the Gardner situation was confirmed by Park County Sheriff's deputies who responded to calls of violent individuals in the town's main street area. 2 people, both showing symptoms consistent with infection, both attacking others. The sheriff's report indicated that both infected individuals had been in the park earlier in the day and had driven to Gardner before symptoms fully manifested. Gardner is 800 people in a town that exists primarily to serve Yellowstone visitors. It has 1 main street, a handful of hotels and restaurants, 1 small medical clinic, and a sheriff's office that serves the entire northern part of Park County. It does not have the infrastructure to manage an outbreak. At 4:52 p.m., I received a call that I want to describe carefully because it represents the kind of decision that people in small, Montana towns have been making for 100 years when things go wrong and help is far away. The caller was Linda Greer, who owns the Yellowstone Gateway Inn in Gardner. Linda said, "David, I've got 43 guests in my hotel right now. I just heard the sheriff's radio traffic. I'm locking my doors, and I'm not unlocking them until someone official tells me it's safe. I have food for 2 days in my kitchen. I have a generator. I have 43 people who came here to visit Yellowstone, and they're going to shelter here because my building is solid and my doors are good." I asked, "Linda, how are your guests responding?" She said, "They're scared, but they're listening." I told them what's happening, and I told them their options, and they agreed to stay put. She said, "We're Montanans, David. We know how to be in a building when the weather's bad. This is just different weather." At 4:55 p.m., Sarah called from Old Faithful with an update that changed the tactical picture significantly. The Rangers had successfully consolidated approximately 700 of the original 800 Old Faithful Inn guests into secured areas of the building. The remaining 100 were either in unsecured positions within the building, had fled to other structures in the Old Faithful complex, or were unaccounted for. More critically, Sarah said they'd identified the source of the initial wildlife infection. She said, "There's a thermal feature about a quarter-mile from the main geyser basin that's been showing unusual biological activity for the past week. Water samples sent to the park lab showed anomalous protein structures. The Park Service was investigating it as a potential new extremophile species. Now we think it was something else." I asked, "You're saying the infection originated in a hot spring?" She said, "I'm saying there's a hot spring with water chemistry that shouldn't exist, and it's near a wildlife trail that bison and elk use regularly. And the first documented animal attacks started appearing 3 days after we noticed the biological anomaly." At 4:58 p.m., if the infection originated in Yellowstone's geothermal features, if it's being spread through thermal water that wildlife drinks from or comes into contact with, then the scope of the potential reservoir is not just the current wildlife population. It's the geothermal system itself, which is fed by the supervolcano, and which produces thousands of hot springs and geysers and thermal features across the park. That's a reservoir that can't be quarantined or contained through conventional means. At 5:01 p.m., Marcus was on the phone with the USGS Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, which monitors the park's volcanic and geothermal activity. He put them on speaker, and I heard Dr. James Chun, a geologist with USGS, say something that made both of us go very still. Dr. Chun said, "If you're describing protein structures in thermal water that don't match any known extremophile profiles, and if those proteins are showing prion-like characteristics, then you're potentially describing a prion variant that evolved in extreme geothermal conditions. Yellowstone's thermal features have conditions found almost nowhere else on Earth. Temperatures above boiling, extreme pH ranges, mineral concentrations that would kill normal life. If something evolved to survive in that environment, and then jumped to wildlife that came into contact with that water, you're dealing with a pathogen that's adapted to conditions that would destroy most biological agents." He paused. He said, "It might be incredibly durable, and it might be impossible to eliminate from the thermal features where it originated." At 5:04 p.m., I broadcast that information because the people making decisions about this outbreak needed to understand that conventional containment strategies might not work if the source is the geothermal system itself. You can quarantine wildlife, you can evacuate people, you can establish perimeters, but you can't quarantine a volcanic system. At 5:07 p.m., the Wyoming National Guard's advance element arrived at Jackson Hole Airport, approximately 60 miles south of the park. The Guard commander, Colonel Thomas Wright, established communication with park rangers and began coordinating a response plan. The plan, as Marcus relayed it to me from monitoring the Guard frequency, involved 3 phases: immediate security of the gateway communities outside the park, establishment of controlled evacuation routes for park visitors, and systematic clearing of park facilities to ensure no infected remained in buildings being used for shelter. Timeline for Phase 1, immediate. Timeline for Phase 2, 4 to 6 hours. Timeline for Phase 3, 12 to 24 hours. At 5:10 p.m., I need every person in Yellowstone to hear this. The National Guard is here. Organized response is being established. But organized response takes time, and in that time, you need to maintain your current security position. If you are in a secured building, stay there. If you are in an RV, stay there. If you are in a defensive position, hold it. The next 6 hours are going to be about waiting, and waiting is hard, but it's what keeps you alive. At 5:13 p.m., the first coordinated evacuation began at Canyon Village. Rangers and Guard personnel established a secured corridor from the Canyon Lodge to a parking area where buses were being staged. Approximately 400 people were being moved in organized groups to the buses, which would transport them to Gardner for processing and medical assessment. The operation was expected to take 2 hours. Sarah, who had been redeployed from Old Faithful to coordinate communications between ranger stations, told me that Canyon Village was chosen for first evacuation because it had the highest concentration of people in a single defensible location, and because the road from Canyon to Gardner was the most direct route with the fewest complications. At 5:16 p.m., Robert from the Madison Junction campground called back. He said, "David, we can see infected from our RV windows. 2 individuals moving through the campground. They're not moving fast, but they're persistent. They're going from RV to RV trying doors." I said, "Robert, your doors are locked?" He said, "Affirmative. And I've instructed my family not to make noise. We're sitting in the dark so we don't draw attention." I said, "That's exactly right. Infected are drawn to sound and light. Stay dark, stay quiet, and let them pass." He said, "How long do they stay mobile?" I said, "Based on data from other outbreaks, 60 to 90 minutes after transition before they start degrading. If these are from the early wave, they're going to stop moving soon. Time is on your side." At 5:19 p.m., the sun was lower but still bright, and Yellowstone in late afternoon light is as beautiful as any place on Earth. The mountains to the east were lit up. The geysers were producing their normal steam. The forests were green and vast. It's hard to describe what it's like to broadcast emergency information about death and infection while looking at scenery that people travel across the world to see, but that's what tonight is. At 5:22 p.m., Dr. Kim called with medical data that I need to share because it affects decision-making for anyone who's been bitten. She said, "David, we've attempted aggressive wound decontamination on 4 bite victims who reached us within the critical window. 3 of those 4 are not showing progression. 1 progressed despite immediate treatment. That's a 75% success rate with immediate intervention, which is consistent with data from other outbreaks. The window is 5 minutes or less from bite to treatment. After that, progression is invariable. 5 minutes. In Yellowstone, where the nearest hospital is an hour away, 5 minutes means on-site treatment only. It means people who are bitten need to have antiseptic and irrigation capability immediately available, or they need to accept that progression is coming." At 5:25 p.m., Marcus showed me updated numbers from the Park Service. Confirmed infected in the park, approximately 80 individuals. Secured civilians in defensible positions, approximately 9,000. Unaccounted for, approximately 3,000, which includes people in backcountry, people in vehicles, people in campsites, and people whose locations weren't documented when the outbreak began. 3,000 unaccounted for in 2.2 million acres of wilderness. Some of those 3,000 are fine. They're in secure positions and just haven't communicated with rangers yet. Some of them are infected and mobile. Some of them are infected and no longer mobile. Some of them are uninfected, but exposed and in the progression window. We won't know the actual numbers until the evacuation and clearing operations are complete. At 5:28 p.m., I took a call from someone whose story I want to share because it represents what survival looks like when you don't have the option of getting to a building. The caller was Amanda Torres, a backcountry ranger who had been on patrol in the Lamar Valley when the outbreak began. Amanda said she'd been monitoring the radio traffic and understood that she was approximately 15 miles from the nearest road and 25 miles from the nearest ranger station. She said, "David, I'm in wilderness with no extraction available. I've got my tent, my gear, and my radio. I've seen elk in the area showing erratic behavior. What's my play?" I said, "Amanda, what's your elevation and overnight temperature forecast?" She said, "I'm at 7,000 feet. Overnight low around 40 degrees. I said, "Set up your tent in a defensible position, somewhere with visibility in multiple directions. Stay inside the tent after dark. Don't use lights. Don't make noise. The cold might suppress infected behavior based on what we saw in Alaska. And at 40 degrees with infected that are already degraded from time, they're going to become less mobile as the temperature drops." She said, "So I'm camping through a zombie outbreak." I said, "You're using the resources you have to survive in conditions you didn't choose. That's just wilderness skills applied to different circumstances." She said, "Copy that." Amanda Torres, Lamar Valley, still on the job. At 5:31 p.m., the Old Faithful evacuation plan was finalized. The 700 people secured in the inn and surrounding structures would shelter in place overnight and be evacuated at first. Light when guard reinforcements arrived, and the tactical situation was more controlled. Sarah confirmed this plan and said it was the right decision given the complexity of moving 700 people after dark through an area with confirmed infected presence. At 5:34 p.m., the temperature was 74 degrees and dropping steadily. By 9 p.m., when full dark arrived, we'd be in the high 50s. By midnight, we'd be in the mid-40s. Yellowstone's cold nights, which make camping uncomfortable, even in summer, were going to be tonight's weapon against infected who were already degrading from time and progression. Stay with us, because Yellowstone has 4.5 hours until dark, and everything changes when the sun goes down. At 5:38 p.m., the first systematic wildlife assessment began under Dr. Chun's coordination with park biologists. The assessment's purpose: determine the extent of infection in Yellowstone's mammal populations and identify which species were showing symptoms. The initial data, compiled from ranger reports across the park, showed confirmed erratic behavior in bison, elk, black bears, and one report of a wolf pack near Tower Roosevelt exhibiting unusual aggression. Dr. Chun called in at 5:40 p.m. to share preliminary conclusions. He said, "If multiple large mammal species are infected, the transmission mechanism is likely through a common resource. Water is the most probable vector. The infected thermal feature that Sarah identified at Old Faithful could be one of multiple sources, or it could be that the pathogen has spread through Yellowstone's interconnected thermal water system." He paused. He said, "David, Yellowstone's thermal features are all fed by the same deep geothermal reservoir. If the pathogen is in that reservoir, it's potentially in thermal water throughout the park. Any wildlife drinking from thermal runoff, any animal coming into contact with thermal mud or steam condensate could be exposed." At 5:43 p.m., that assessment changes the entire scope of containment. If the infection is in Yellowstone's geothermal system, it's not something that evacuating visitors and quarantining current infected will solve. It's an endemic reservoir that will continue producing infected wildlife as long as animals interact with thermal features. At 5:46 p.m., Marcus got through to the CDC's Emergency Operations Center. The CDC epidemiologist he spoke with, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, confirmed that CDC teams were being deployed to Bozeman and would arrive within 12 hours. She also confirmed that the geothermal origin theory, if accurate, represented a novel transmission mechanism that had not been documented in any previous outbreak. Dr. Mitchell said, through Marcus's speakerphone, if this prion variant evolved in extreme geothermal conditions, it's likely highly thermostable, meaning it can withstand high temperatures that would denature normal proteins. It's also likely resistant to standard decontamination methods. Thermal features that contain it can't be drained or treated conventionally. This might be a permanent reservoir. At 5:49 p.m., permanent reservoir means Yellowstone potentially remains at outbreak risk indefinitely. It means the park can't simply reopen after this incident is resolved. It means long-term monitoring, ongoing wildlife management, and possibly permanent closure of areas near confirmed contaminated thermal features. At 5:52 p.m., I received a call from John Mathis, a wildlife photographer who has spent 40 summers in Yellowstone, and who called because he had information about wildlife behavior over the past week that he now realized was significant. John said, "David, I've been photographing the Hayden Valley bison herd for 2 weeks. Starting about 5 days ago, I noticed several animals separating from the herd and showing what I interpreted as illness. Lethargy, poor coordination, reduced grazing. I reported it to rangers as possible disease, but not as anything urgent. Now I'm listening to you describe infection symptoms, and I'm realizing those bison were in the early stages. 5 days ago. The infection has been in the wildlife population for at least 5 days, possibly longer, before it jumped to humans in sufficient numbers to be recognized as an outbreak. That's 5 days of infected animals moving through the park, potentially spreading the infection through contact with other wildlife or through excretions in water sources. At 5:55 p.m., I broadcast John's information because it matters for understanding the timeline and the scope. This didn't start today. Today is when we recognized it. The infection has been building in Yellowstone's ecosystem for days or potentially longer, and what we're seeing now is the result of that build reaching critical mass. At 5:58 p.m., the Canyon Village evacuation completed its first phase. 400 people successfully moved to buses and departed for Gardner under guard and ranger escort. The evacuation operation had been professional and efficient, with no incidents during the transfer. Colonel Wright confirmed that Phase 2 evacuations would begin at Lake Hotel and Bridge Bay Marina once the Canyon buses cleared the road network. At 6:01 p.m., Sarah called with an update from Old Faithful that I want to share because it represents what happens when people make good decisions under terrible circumstances. The 700 people sheltered in the Old Faithful Inn and surrounding structures had self-organized into a functional community in the past 2 hours. They'd established watch rotations, food rationing, medical assessment for anyone with injuries, and communications protocols using hotel phones and personal radios. Sarah said, "These are tourists who came here for vacation, and they've turned into an organized survival community in under 2 hours. One of them is a trauma nurse from Denver. One is a structural engineer from Seattle, who assessed the building and identified the most defensible areas. One is a former Marine who organized the watch rotation. People are using their skills." At 6:04 p.m., that's what survival communities look like when they form successfully. Not everyone panicking individually, but people recognizing that collective organization produces better outcomes than individual action. The Old Faithful survivors are going to make it through tonight because they made that transition from crowd to community. At 6:07 p.m., Robert called from Madison Junction. He said, "David, the infected who are trying RV doors have stopped moving. One is sitting on the ground about 40 feet from us. The other is standing, but swaying like they can't maintain balance. They've been mobile for what I estimate is about 70 minutes based on when we first saw them." I said, "They're degrading. The combination of time since transition and the dropping temperature is shutting them down. By full dark, they'll be immobile." Robert said, My sons want to know if they can come out and see. I said, absolutely not. Immobile doesn't mean safe until you can verify they're completely non-responsive. Stay in the RV until rangers can clear the area. He said, copy that. We'll wait. At 6:10 p.m., the temperature reached 68 degrees. Sunset was in 2 hours and 50 minutes. The overnight low of 48 degrees was forecast for around 2 a.m. Between now and 2 a.m., the temperature was going to drop 20 degrees, and every degree downward was going to further degrade infected who were already in late stages. At 6:13 p.m., Dr. Kim called with updated Bozeman health status. The 2 staff members who had been bitten during patient restraint were now in full transition and had been secured in isolation rooms. The hospital had implemented lockdown protocols for the emergency department and was diverting all new trauma cases to Billings, which is 2 hours east. Dr. Kim said, we can't safely receive any more patients from the outbreak until we're certain our facility is secure. Anyone in Yellowstone who needs medical attention is going to have to wait or be transported to Billings. At 6:16 p.m., that means Yellowstone's primary medical resource is offline. The closest functioning emergency department is now 2.5 hours from the park. Anyone who's bitten or injured in the park is dependent on on-site ranger first aid unless they can be transported to Billings, and the roads from Yellowstone to Billings go through park wilderness and small towns with no medical capability. At 6:19 p.m., I received a call from someone whose voice I recognized immediately because we'd grown up in Montana together and because Marcus and I had been wondering whether he was in the park today. The caller was Danny Orozco, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Warden, currently in Yellowstone on patrol. Danny said, David, I've been monitoring your broadcast while moving through the park. I'm currently near Norris Geyser Basin, and I've confirmed multiple infected bison in the thermal areas. I've also confirmed something else. The infected animals are avoiding the hottest thermal features. They're staying away from active geysers and boiling pools. Whatever drives their behavior, it doesn't override basic thermal pain response completely. They're still avoiding extreme heat. I asked, what does that tell us tactically? He said, it tells us that areas near the most extreme thermal features might be naturally safer because infected avoid them. It also tells us that the infection is doing something complex to neural function. It's overriding social behavior and pain response to normal threats, but not to extreme existential threats like boiling water. At 6:22 p.m., Marcus and I discussed Danny's observation and came to a conclusion that I'm going to share. If infected avoid extreme thermal areas, then humans sheltering near, but not dangerously close to hot springs or active geysers, might have a natural barrier that infected won't cross. It's not a perfect defense, but it's information worth having if you're choosing where to shelter. At 6:25 p.m., the Lake Hotel evacuation began. Approximately 600 guests being moved in organized groups to buses staged at the Lake Village parking area. This evacuation was more complex than Canyon because Lake Hotel is larger, older, and has more interior spaces where people had dispersed to. Rangers estimated the operation would take 3 hours. At 6:28 p.m., Amanda Torres called in from Lamar Valley. She said, David, I've set up my defensive camp position. I have visibility in all directions. I've seen one infected elk at a distance moving away from my location. Temperature is dropping faster than I expected at this elevation. I'm in my tent with all my gear, and I'm prepared to stay here until morning. She said, I want you to know that if I don't make it, my field notes are in my pack, and they document everything I observed today. Someone needs to retrieve them for the investigation. I said, Amanda, you're going to make it. You have the skills, the gear, and the knowledge. You're doing everything right. She said, I appreciate that, David, but if things go wrong, I wanted someone to know about the notes. At 6:31 p.m., I want every backcountry camper and every person in a remote position in Yellowstone to hear this. Amanda Torres's approach is correct. Defensible position, visibility, avoid drawing attention, trust your gear, use the cold as a weapon against infected. You can survive a night in Yellowstone wilderness with proper preparation, even with infected in the area. The wilderness skills you have are the same skills you need, just applied to unusual threats. At 6:34 p.m., the sun was getting lower, and the light was changing to that particular gold that mountains produce an hour before sunset. Yellowstone's beauty doesn't stop for human emergencies. The geysers keep erupting. The bison keep grazing. The forests keep standing. The difference tonight is that some of those bison are infected, and some of those forests contain people hiding from them. At 6:37 p.m., Marcus received confirmation from the guard that Phase 3 operations, the systematic clearing of park facilities, would begin at dawn and continue for an estimated 18 to 24 hours. Every building, every campsite, every developed area in the park would be cleared and secured before any return operations were considered. That's a massive undertaking, requiring hundreds of personnel and careful coordination, but it's what comprehensive clearance requires. At 6:40 p.m., Jennifer from West Yellowstone called back. She said the infected guests at her hotel had been contained by local law enforcement and guard personnel who had arrived from Jackson Hole. The town was implementing its own lockdown protocols and was preparing to receive evacuated park visitors once the park evacuation operations were fully underway. She said, "West Yellowstone is ready. We've done this before with fires. We know how to handle people fleeing from the park. This is just different circumstances." At 6:43 p.m., Linda from Gardner reported similar readiness. Her hotel's 43 guests were secure and calm. The town had organized its own perimeter watch, using volunteers and sheriff's deputies. Food supplies were being consolidated. Medical assessment capability was being established using the town's small clinic. Gardner was ready to receive evacuees. At 6:46 p.m., the Montana Gateway communities were doing what Montana communities do when something goes wrong, organizing themselves to handle it with the resources available until outside help arrives. That's not unique to Montana, but it's something Montana does particularly well. Stay on this frequency. We're 2 hours and 14 minutes from sunset, and Yellowstone is preparing for the first night of this outbreak. At 6:50 p.m., Dr. Chun called with USGS's formal assessment of the geothermal origin hypothesis. He said they'd pulled historical data on thermal feature chemistry and compared it to recent sampling, and they'd identified a pattern. 3 thermal features in different areas of the park had shown anomalous protein structures in water samples taken over the past 2 weeks. All 3 features were on wildlife trails. All 3 showed similar chemical signatures, suggesting a common source deeper in the geothermal system. Dr. Chun said, "We believe the pathogen emerged from the deep thermal reservoir and is being expressed through multiple surface features simultaneously. That means containment of individual features won't work. The source is deep, it's distributed, and it's producing infected water at multiple points across the park." At 6:53 p.m., that assessment means Yellowstone's geothermal system is the Outbreak reservoir, and it can't be eliminated. The park will require permanent monitoring, ongoing wildlife management, and potentially significant changes to visitor access and safety protocols. This changes Yellowstone permanently. At 6:56 p.m., I received a call from Park Superintendent Catherine Reyes, calling from park headquarters at Mammoth. Catherine said, "David, I'm calling because you've been providing information to the public faster than our official channels, and I want to coordinate rather than compete." She said, "We're establishing a 24-hour information hotline, but until that's operational, I'm authorizing you to be considered an official park information source. Any guidance I give you, you have my authority to broadcast immediately." I said, "Superintendent, what's your current guidance?" She said, "Everyone in secured positions stays secured overnight. All evacuations suspended at dark and resume at first light. Guard and rangers maintaining perimeter security through the night. Expect overnight temperatures in the mid-40s, which will suppress infected mobility significantly. We're treating tonight as a hold operation and tomorrow as the active evacuation and clearing operation. She said, "Tell people we're going to get them out, just not tonight. Tonight they shelter, and tomorrow we move them systematically and safely." At 6:59 p.m., I broadcast Superintendent Rice's guidance with the authority she'd just given me, which is something I never expected to have, but which matters because people respond differently to official authorization than they do to just a radio host telling them what he thinks they should do. At 7:02 p.m., the sun touched the mountain peaks to the west, and the light shifted to that deep gold that photographers love, and that tonight feels more like a timer counting down to something difficult. Full dark in 58 minutes. Overnight temperatures starting their drop toward the mid-40s. 12,000 people distributed across the park in various defensive positions, waiting for morning. At 7:05 p.m., Sarah called with the Old Faithful evening status. 700 people secured and organized. Food supplies inventoried and rationed for 3 days if necessary. Medical supplies consolidated. Watch rotation established. She said, "We had one person show panic attack symptoms, and the trauma nurse from Denver talked them through it. We had 2 people with medication needs, and we found other guests who had the same medications and were willing to share. We're functioning." I said, "Sarah, you've been on duty for over 3 hours. Are you holding up?" She said, "I'm a Yellowstone ranger, David. I've camped in this park in January. I've dealt with bears and tourists and lightning storms and geysers that almost boiled people alive. This is different, but it's not beyond what I can handle." She said, "Ask me again in 12 hours. At 7:08 p.m., Robert updated from Madison Junction. The infected near his RV had both become completely immobile. He said, "One is sitting, one is standing. Neither has moved in the past 20 minutes. Temperature is 62 degrees and dropping. I think they're done." I said, "Don't assume that until rangers confirm it. But you're probably right that they've reached end-stage degradation. Time and cold worked in your favor." He said, "My boys want to know if this means Yellowstone is going to close forever." I said, "I don't know, Robert, but I know that Yellowstone has survived fires and earthquakes and floods, and this park has been here for millions of years before people came, and it'll be here millions of years after. Whatever happens with management and access, the park itself isn't going anywhere." At 7:11 p.m., I want to address something that several callers have asked about, which is what happens to Yellowstone after tonight. The honest answer is that I don't know. The park might close indefinitely, while the geothermal reservoir situation is assessed and managed. The park might reopen with significant restrictions on where visitors can go and what they can do. The park might implement permanent monitoring of wildlife and thermal features that changes the visitor experience fundamentally. What I do know is that Yellowstone is one of the world's most important natural preserves, and that the government and scientists and park service will do everything possible to keep it accessible while keeping people safe. It won't be the same, but it'll still be Yellowstone. At 7:14 p.m., the temperature reached 58 degrees. By the time full dark arrived, we'd be at 54. By midnight, in the high 40s. The infected who were still mobile were fighting against degradation, time, and dropping temperature, and they were losing all 3 battles. At 7:17 p.m., Danny Orozco called in from Norris. He said, "David, I've confirmed that infected wildlife are seeking thermal areas as temperature drops, but they're maintaining distance from the hottest features. They're clustering in the warm zones between extreme thermal and ambient temperature. That's important for people sheltering near geothermal areas. Don't get so close to hot springs that you risk thermal injury yourself, but being near thermal areas might create a buffer zone." I BROADCAST. That immediately, because people making decisions about overnight positions needed that information, while they still had visibility to assess their surroundings. At 7:20 p.m., Marcus showed me the park map with updated positions of secured populations. Old Faithful, 700. Lake Hotel, 600 now fully evacuated. Canyon Village, evacuated. Madison Junction area, approximately 400 in various RV and vehicle positions. Mammoth area, approximately 200 secured in the Mammoth Hot Springs Hotel. Grant Village, 300 secured in lodging. Various backcountry positions. Estimated 500, including Amanda Torres in Lamar Valley. Total accounted for, approximately 11,700. Still unaccounted, approximately 300, which included people who'd left the park before the closure, people in deep backcountry on multi-day trips who hadn't heard about the outbreak, and people whose locations were simply unknown. At 7:23 p.m., Dr. Kim called with end-of-day medical data from Bozeman Health. Total patients treated from the outbreak, 17. Deceased, 9. Currently in acute transition and secured, 4, including the 2 staff members. Treated successfully with immediate wound decontamination, 4. She said the 75% success rate with immediate intervention was holding, but that the window was absolutely critical. She also said the hospital would remain in lockdown overnight and reopen emergency services at dawn after full facility clearance. At 7:26 p.m., Colonel Wright provided a National Guard status update. Current Guard personnel in the area. Approximately 800 soldiers between Jackson Hole, West Yellowstone, and Gardner. Additional resources arriving overnight. Another 400. Total for dawn operations. 1,200 soldiers plus park rangers and local law enforcement. That's enough personnel to conduct systematic clearing operations and coordinated evacuations. Colonel Wright said, "We're treating this as a large-scale disaster response with the added complexity of active threats in the form of infected individuals. The park's geography works in our favor because the road system is limited and we can control movement. The park's size works against us because it's 900,000 hectares and we can't be everywhere. But we have enough resources to do this right." At 7:29 p.m., the light was fading fast now. Not full dark yet, but the deep twilight that comes before it in mountains. The sky was still blue above, but the valleys were in shadow and the temperature was dropping noticeably. I could see it in the steam coming off the Yellowstone River in downtown Bozeman through the studio window, the way cold air meets warmer water and produces visible vapor. At 7:32 p.m., I took a call from a woman named Carol Jong, who is a wildlife biologist from UC Davis, who had been in Yellowstone studying wealth behavior when the outbreak began. Carol said, "David, I'm at the Roosevelt Lodge with about 60 other people. We're secured and we're fine. But I need to tell you something about what I observed today that I think matters for long-term management." I said, "Go ahead, Carol." She said, "I watched an infected wolf pack for 2 hours this afternoon from a safe, elevated position. The infection changed their behavior, but it didn't eliminate pack structure completely. They were still moving as a coordinated unit, still showing some social behaviors toward each other, even though they were aggressive toward everything else. That suggests the infection is doing something more complex than just destroying all neural function. It's selectively impacting specific brain systems while leaving others partially functional." I asked, "What does that mean for management?" She said, "It means infected wildlife might be more organized and more persistent than we'd expect from something that's just destroying the brain randomly. It also means studying these infected animals, if we can do it safely, might tell us important things about how the infection works." At 7:35 p.m., Carol's observations suggest that even as we're managing the immediate crisis, there's a scientific opportunity here to understand this pathogen better through careful observation of infected wildlife. Yellowstone could become not just an outbreak site, but a research location that helps us understand how to manage this infection in other places. At 7:38 p.m., the sun set behind the Gallatin Range to the west of Yellowstone. Not full dark, we still had civil twilight for another 30 minutes, but the sun was gone and the temperature immediately began dropping faster. 54 degrees and falling. At 7:41 p.m., Sarah reported from Old Faithful that all 700 secured people had moved away from windows and exterior walls to interior positions as darkness approached. They'd established light discipline, keeping illumination to minimum necessary levels to avoid attracting attention from any infected that might still be mobile outside. She said, "We're settling in for the night. It's going to be cold in here because we can't run heating systems at full capacity without drawing power that might be needed for other systems. But everyone has blankets and we're huddling in groups for warmth. That's survival. Not dramatic, not movie-worthy. Just 700 people sitting in the dark in a cold building managing their resources and waiting for morning." At 7:44 p.m., Amanda Torres called from Lamar Valley for her evening check-in. She said, "David, I'm in my sleeping bag in my tent. Temperature out here is 52 degrees. I can hear elk in the distance, but nothing close. I saw stars for about 10 minutes before cloud cover moved in." She said, "I've been thinking about what I'm going to tell people if I make it through tonight. I think I'm going to tell them that Yellowstone is still beautiful, even when it's dangerous. That's not new information. The park has always been both those things. Tonight just made it more obvious." At 7:47 p.m., Amanda Torres in a tent in Lamar Valley, understanding that beauty and danger coexist is maybe the most Yellowstone thing I've heard all day. Stay with us. Full dark is 13 minutes away, and Yellowstone is about to experience its first night with infected in the wilderness and 12,000 people waiting for dawn. At 7:53 p.m., full dark arrived over Yellowstone. The civil twilight ended, and the park went completely black except for the lights of secured buildings, which were running at minimum necessary levels to conserve power and avoid attracting attention. Marcus and I sat in the studio, watching the darkness through our windows, and understanding that, for the next 11 hours until sunrise, everyone in that park was in the dark with something that most of them had never imagined they'd have to face. At 7:56 p.m., the overnight temperature monitoring began. Park rangers at various locations were reporting temperatures to help us understand how the cold was affecting infected mobility. Mammoth, 52 degrees. Old Faithful, 49 degrees. Canyon, 51 degrees. Madison Junction, 48 degrees. Lamar Valley, 47 degrees and dropping fastest due to elevation and exposure. At 7:59 p.m., Robert reported the final status of the infected near his RV. He said, "David, they haven't moved in over an hour. Both are completely stationary. One is sitting slumped forward. One is standing, but looks like a statue. I'm treating them as inactive, but we're still maintaining lockdown in the RV." I said, "That's the right call. Inactive doesn't mean safe until professionals can confirm complete non-response. But it does mean you can relax slightly and get some rest. You've been in high alert mode for 4 hours." He said, "My wife is reading to the boys. We're treating this like a camping adventure with unusual circumstances. They're doing better than I expected." At 8:02 p.m., the first confirmed overnight infected immobilization was reported from the Old Faithful area. Sarah said rangers had visual confirmation through night vision equipment that all infected individuals identified in that area were now stationary and showing no movement for extended periods. She said, "The combination of time since transition and the temperature drop below 50 degrees appears to have stopped them completely." At 8:05 p.m., that's the first confirmation that the cold suppression effect we saw in Alaska is working in Yellowstone's moderate cold. Not as dramatically as Alaska's extreme cold, but 48 to 52 degrees is enough, combined with time, to shut down infected who are already in advanced degradation stages. At 8:08 p.m., Dr. Chun provided updated analysis on the geothermal situation. He said USGS was coordinating with the CDC and the Park Service on a long-term management plan that would involve continuous monitoring of thermal features, regular testing of thermal water for protein anomalies, wildlife health surveillance, and potentially restricted access to areas with confirmed contaminated features. He said, Yellowstone will reopen, but it'll reopen with a level of scientific monitoring and management that hasn't existed before. The park is going to become a long-term research site, whether we plan for that or not. At 8:11 p.m., I broadcast Dr. Chun's assessment because people needed to understand that Yellowstone's future was being actively planned by people who understood both the park's importance and the outbreak's implications. This isn't just reaction anymore. This is long-term strategy. At 8:14 p.m., Marcus received confirmation from the guard that all gateway communities were secured and ready for evacuee reception at dawn. West Yellowstone, ready. Gardner, ready. Jackson, ready. Medical assessment protocols established. Transportation logistics coordinated. Food and temporary shelter arranged. The communities outside the park had used the afternoon and evening to prepare for receiving potentially thousands of people who would need processing, medical screening, and in some cases, ongoing care. At 8:17 p.m., I want to say something about the Montana and Wyoming communities that surround Yellowstone. These are small towns. West Yellowstone is 1,300 people. Gardner is 800. They don't have huge resources or vast infrastructure. What they have is experience managing tourism, experience with wilderness emergencies, and a culture that says when something goes wrong, you handle it with what you have, and you don't complain about what you don't have. Those communities are going to save lives tomorrow, not because they have fancy equipment or unlimited resources, but because they're organized and practical, and they understand that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just be ready when people need you. At 8:20 p.m., the temperature reached 46 degrees at the coldest monitoring stations. The forecast overnight low of 48 had been exceeded, and temperatures were still falling. By midnight, we'd potentially be in the low 40s. That's cold enough to significantly impact any infected still mobile, which at this point was an increasingly small number. At 8:23 p.m., Sarah gave me the Old Faithful night update. 700 people settled into sleeping positions, as much as the building allowed. Temperature inside the building was 58 degrees, cold but not dangerous with blankets and body heat and layered clothing. No incidents, no panic, just quiet management of resources and time. Sarah said, I'm watching people who came here for vacation, functioning like an organized survival unit. They're sharing food. They're checking on each other. They're maintaining watch rotations without being asked. She said, I've seen disaster responses in this park before. This is one of the best. At 8:26 p.m., Amanda Torres checked in from Limar Valley. She said, temperature in my tent is about 50 degrees with my body heat and sleeping bag. I can hear wind, but no animal sounds close. I've accepted that I'm not sleeping much tonight, but that's okay. I've had worse nights in worse conditions on this job. She said, I'm spending the time writing detailed field observations about infected wildlife behavior. If I make it out, the data is useful. If I don't, the notes are still useful for whoever finds them. At 8:29 p.m., Amanda Torres writing scientific field notes while sheltering from infected wildlife in a tent in Yellowstone. Wilderness is the most backcountry ranger thing I've ever heard, and I told her so. She laughed and said, what else am I going to do, David? Panic? That doesn't help anything. At 8:32 p.m., I received a call from Dr. Mitchell at the CDC, who had been monitoring the broadcast from Atlanta and who wanted to provide some medical context for what tomorrow's evacuation and assessment would involve. She said every person evacuated from the park would need medical screening, including temperature check, visual wound assessment, an interview about potential exposure. Anyone with confirmed bites would need immediate assessment and potential isolation, depending on timeline and symptoms. Anyone with fever would need investigation. She said, "This is going to take time. Processing 11,000 people through medical screening is a multi-hour operation, even with optimal resources. People need to understand that evacuation doesn't mean immediate release. It means transportation to safety and an assessment before release." At 8:35 p.m., I broadcast Dr. Mitchell's information because people waiting in Yellowstone needed to understand that tomorrow's evacuation was going to be a process, not an instant return to normal. But process is better than staying in a cold building or an RV or a tent for another night, so the process is worth it. At 8:38 p.m., the confirmed infected count was updated by the Guard based on systematic documentation from all reporting stations. Total infected identified during the outbreak, approximately 130. Confirmed immobile due to degradation and cold, approximately 90. Status unknown, approximately 40, which included infected who entered wilderness areas and whose current status couldn't be verified without daylight search operations. 130 infected out of 12,000 people in the park. That's approximately 1% of the population. In raw numbers, that's catastrophic. In percentage terms, relative to what it could have been with less organized response, it's evidence that rapid action and good decisions prevented exponential spread. At 8:41 p.m., Robert's boys asked him a question that he relayed to me. They wanted to know if the bison and elk in Yellowstone would all have to be killed because of the infection. Robert asked me to answer because he didn't know what to tell them. I said, "Robert, I'm going to answer honestly. Some infected animals will need to be euthanized, but Yellowstone has thousands of bison and 10,000 elk. The infection is in a fraction of the population. Wildlife biologists and park rangers are going to have to make very difficult decisions about management, but those decisions will be based on protecting both the ecosystem and human safety. The park's wildlife populations as a whole will survive this." Robert said, "My boys say thank you for not sugarcoating it. They're 16 and 14, and they'd rather have truth than comfort." At 8:44 p.m., Colonel Wright provided the dawn operations briefing. Guard units would begin moving into the park at first light, approximately 5:45 a.m. Operations would proceed in phases: immediate security of evacuation routes, systematic building clearing in parallel with evacuation bus loading, backcountry search and rescue for known positions like Amanda Torres, and finally comprehensive park-wide assessment that would take multiple days. Timeline for all visitors out of the park: estimated 24 hours from dawn. Timeline for complete park clearance and security: 3 to 5 days. At 8:47 p.m., 3 to 5 days means the park stays closed for nearly a week, while every facility, every trail, every campground is cleared and verified safe. That's the careful approach. That's the approach that ensures nobody gets surprised by an infected individual who was missed in initial operations. At 8:50 p.m., Linda from Gardner called with an evening update. Her 43 guests were settled in for the night. The town was quiet, and preparations for receiving evacuees at dawn were complete. She said, "Gardner has been the north entrance to Yellowstone since before there was a park service. We've been welcoming people in and getting people out for over 100 years. Tomorrow, we do it again under different circumstances." At 8:53 p.m., Jennifer from West Yellowstone reported similar readiness. She said, "We're ready. Our hotel is ready. The town is ready. Tell the people in the park that we're here, and we're prepared to take care of them when they come out." At 8:56 p.m., the temperature reached 43 degrees at the coldest stations. Lamar Valley, where Amanda Torres was camping, 41 degrees. That's genuine cold, the kind that requires good gear and proper preparation. Amanda checked in at 8:58 p.m. and said she was fine. Her gear was rated for much lower temperatures, and she was actually more comfortable than she'd been during the high alert period earlier, because now she knew that anything outside her tent in this cold was either harmless wildlife or degraded infected that weren't mobile. At 9:01 p.m., Marcus and I have been on the air for 5 hours and 19 minutes. We've coordinated with park rangers, National Guard, CDC, USGS, hospital personnel, gateway communities, and approximately 12,000 people scattered across Yellowstone. We've provided information that helps people make better decisions than they would have made without it. And we're not done yet, because dawn is 8 hours and 44 minutes away, and people need to hear a voice through that time. At 9:04 p.m., I want every person in Yellowstone right now to hear this from me directly. You made it through the hardest part. You made it through the crisis hours, when things were changing fast and information was incomplete, and decisions had to be made with uncertainty. The overnight is going to be cold and uncomfortable and long, but it's not going to be dangerous in the way the afternoon was dangerous. The infected have degraded. The cold is suppressing mobility. The guard is positioned. The evacuation plan is set. You just have to make it to dawn. And you can do that. At 9:07 p.m., Sarah called one more time before her overnight watch rotation. She said, "David, I need to say something on the record. The decision I made to call you at 3:25 p.m. before official channels were ready to acknowledge the outbreak. That decision probably costs me my job. But if it helped even one person make a better decision that kept them alive, it was worth it." She said, "Yellowstone Rangers are public servants. We serve the public. Sometimes that means serving them before the bureaucracy is ready for us to." I said, "Sarah, for what it's worth, I think you made exactly the right call at exactly the right time for exactly the right reasons. What happens to your career is going to be determined by people who weren't here today. But the people who were here know what you did." She said, "That's enough." Then she said she had to go back to her post. At 9:10 p.m., the night settled in over Yellowstone and over Montana, and over this studio, where Marcus and I are going to maintain this frequency until dawn, because that's what we said we'd do, and because the people in that park deserve to have a voice connecting them to something beyond the cold and the dark. Stay with us. Dawn is 8 hours and 35 minutes away. At 9:53 p.m., the temperature across Yellowstone had stabilized in the low to mid-40s. The overnight low would arrive sometime around 2 or 3 a.m., but we were already cold enough that any remaining mobile infected were facing conditions that were shutting them down regardless of how much time they'd been transitioned. Marcus showed me the temperature map, and every monitoring station was showing conditions below 45 degrees. At 9:56 p.m., the infected status reports from all major locations confirmed what the temperature suggested. Old Faithful. 0 mobile infected observed in the past 90 minutes. Madison Junction. Robert reported no movement from the two near his RV for over 2 hours. Mammoth. Rangers reported all infected in that area were stationary. Canyon. Already evacuated and secured. The outbreak's active phase was over. What remained was management, evacuation, and assessment. At 9:59 p.m., I want to address something that several overnight callers have asked about, which is what happens to Yellowstone's future as a national park after tonight. The honest answer that I gave earlier stands. I don't know specifically, but I can tell you what I believe based on Yellowstone's history and on conversations I've had tonight with Park Service leadership and scientists. Yellowstone has survived supervolcano eruptions and ice ages and massive fires that burned a third of the park in 1988 and made people think Yellowstone was destroyed. The park came back from those fires stronger and more biologically diverse than before. Yellowstone is resilient, not despite its extreme conditions, but because of them. The geothermal system that produced tonight's outbreak is the same system that makes Yellowstone unique and invaluable as a natural preserve. The park will adapt. Access will change. Management will change. But Yellowstone itself, the place, the ecosystem, the volcanic system, that's been here for hundreds of thousands of years, and it's going to be here for hundreds of thousands more. At 10:03 p.m., Dr. Chun provided his final assessment of the evening. He said USGS would maintain continuous monitoring of thermal features indefinitely, with particular attention to the 3 features that showed protein anomalies. Wildlife biologists would be tracking animal populations and health markers. The CDC would maintain surveillance protocols. He said, "What happened today changes how we understand human interaction with extreme geothermal environments. Yellowstone becomes a case study in how pathogens can emerge from conditions we didn't know could produce them." At 10:06 p.m., that's science looking at tragedy and asking what can be learned that helps prevent future tragedies. It's not cold. It's how science works. And in this case, the learning might prevent the same scenario from happening at thermal features in Iceland or New Zealand or any of the other places on Earth where similar geothermal conditions exist. At 10:09 p.m., Amanda Torres made her midnight approach check-in. She said, "David, I'm in my sleeping bag and I'm warm enough. I haven't heard animal sounds in over an hour. I've been watching stars through my tent mesh when cloud cover breaks." She said, "I'm thinking about how many nights I've spent in Yellowstone backcountry and how this night is both exactly like those nights and completely different. The skills are the same. The circumstances are different, but the outcome is the same. I'm alive and I'm waiting for morning." I said, "Amanda, you're going to be one of the best stories to come out of tonight. Backcountry Ranger survives outbreak by doing exactly what backcountry rangers do." She said, "I don't want to be a story, David. I just want to do my job. But I appreciate the sentiment." At 10:12 p.m., Robert reported that his family was settling in for sleep. His boys were in sleeping bags. His wife was reading by flashlight. He was maintaining watch from the RV's driver's seat, where he could see the 2 immobile infected outside. He said, "This is the strangest camping trip we've ever taken, but it's not the most uncomfortable. We did Glacier in October once, and that was colder." At 10:15 p.m., the Old Faithful Inn overnight status from Sarah. 700 people distributed between sleeping and watch rotation duty. No incidents. Temperature inside the building was 54 degrees and stable. Food and water supplies adequate. Morale described as surprisingly good considering. Sarah said, "Someone started singing softly about an hour ago. Folk songs, campfire songs, that kind of thing. A few others joined in. Nothing loud, just quiet singing in the dark in a cold building while waiting for morning." She said, "I don't think any of them will forget tonight for the rest of their lives, but I also don't think they'll remember it as the worst night of their lives. They'll remember it as the night they got through something together." At 10:18 p.m., 700 people singing quietly in the dark in the Old Faithful Inn is going to be the image I remember from tonight when I'm old and someone asks me about this outbreak, not the infected, not the crisis hours. 700 people singing. At 10:21 p.m., Colonel Wright provided the pre-dawn operations final briefing. All guard units were in position and ready for 5:45 a.m. operations launch. Evacuation routes secured and tested. Bus staging complete. Medical screening protocols finalized. He said, "By this time tomorrow, every visitor will be out of the park and in safe locations undergoing assessment. The park will be in full clearing operations, and we'll be beginning the long-term planning for how Yellowstone reopens." At 10:24 p.m., I want to say something about the National Guard that I've been thinking about all night. The Guard gets activated for all kinds of emergencies. Floods, fires, civil disturbances, disasters natural and human caused. They train for these activations, knowing that when they get called, it's because something has gone very wrong. Tonight they responded to Yellowstone, showing up with the attitude that they were here to solve problems, rather than assign blame or complain about conditions. That's what emergency response looks like when it's done professionally. At 10:27 p.m., the temperature reached the overnight low at most stations, 42 to 44 degrees across the park. Amanda's position in Lamar Valley, 39 degrees. That's cold enough that Marcus and I started discussing whether we needed to check on her more frequently, because 39 degrees is getting into the range where even good gear requires active management. I called her at 10:29 p.m. She said, "David, I'm fine. I've camped in colder. My bag is rated to 20 degrees, and I'm layered properly." She said, "Stop worrying about me and keep broadcasting to the people who actually need your attention more than I do." At 10:32 p.m., Amanda, Torres telling me to stop worrying about her because other people need the attention more, is exactly the attitude that's going to make her an excellent ranger if the Park Service has any sense about retention decisions. At 10:35 p.m., Marcus had been monitoring social media throughout the evening, and he showed me something that I want to share. Videos and photos from inside secured locations across Yellowstone were being posted to Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. Not sensational content, not panic. Just people documenting what survival looks like. A family sharing food in an RV. Rangers organizing watch rotations in the Old Faithful Inn. Someone's view of stars through a tent mesh. The collective documentation of 12,000 people going through something unprecedented and deciding to record it rather than hide from it. At 10:38 p.m., those social media posts are going to be the primary historical record of tonight. Not official reports, not news coverage. Just people with phones showing what they saw and felt and did. That's what history looks like in the age of everyone carrying cameras. At 10:41 p.m., Dr. Kim provided her final medical update from Bozeman Health. The hospital would reopen emergency services at 6 a.m. after full facility clearance. All 4 infected patients and staff members had been secured overnight without incident. The 4 successfully treated bite victims were stable and showing no progression. She said, "Tomorrow we begin processing evacuees. I estimate we'll see several hundred people who need some level of medical assessment. We're ready." At 10:44 p.m., Superintendent Reyes called with her evening summary. She said, "The park held. The response worked. People are going to go home tomorrow, and they're going to tell stories about this for the rest of their lives, but most of them are going to go home." She said, "I've been a park superintendent for 6 years. I've managed fires and floods, and bear attacks, and tourist stupidity. This was different. But Yellowstone is still Yellowstone, and tomorrow we begin figuring out what that means going forward." At 10:47 p.m., I've been on the air for 7 hours and 5 minutes. Marcus has been running communications and coordination for 7 hours and 3 minutes. We're tired in the way that adrenaline-fueled extended operations make you tired, where you're functional, but you can feel the weight of every hour accumulating. We're going to stay on this frequency through the night because we said we would, and because people deserve consistency when everything else has been inconsistent. At 10:50 p.m., I want to thank everyone who's been listening since 3:42 p.m. when this broadcast started. The park rangers who called in with updates. The scientists who provided context. The National Guard who shared operational information. Robert and his family in the RV. Amanda in her tent. Sarah at Old Faithful. Linda in Gardner. Jennifer in West Yellowstone. Dr. Kim in Bozeman. The 700 people in the Old Faithful Inn. The 12,000 people across Yellowstone who made good decisions with incomplete information in circumstances they never expected to face. You survived today. You're going to make it to dawn. And tomorrow you're going home with a story about Yellowstone that nobody else has, but that everyone who is here shares. At 10:53 p.m., the night is deep now, and the temperature is stable in the low 40s, and the wind is quiet, and Yellowstone is doing what Yellowstone does on cold July nights, which is be beautiful and dangerous and indifferent to human drama. The geysers are still erupting on schedule. The stars are still visible through breaks in the clouds. The thermal features are still steaming. The supervolcano is still there under everything, patient and geological and unconcerned with surface events. At 10:56 p.m., Marcus looked at me and said, "You should do the close now. It's not dawn yet, but you should say what you need to say." I said, "We're not off the air until dawn." He said, "I know, but say it anyway. People need to hear it before they sleep." At 10:59 p.m., Marcus is right. Here's what I want every person in Yellowstone and every person listening anywhere to hear from me. Yellowstone National Park experienced a zombie outbreak today. It started in the geothermal system, spread to wildlife, jumped to humans, and affected 12,000 people who were in the park for the completely reasonable purpose of seeing one of the most extraordinary places on Earth. Those 12,000 people responded with organization, courage, practical decision-making, and the kind of collective resilience that makes you believe in humans, even when humans are facing something that challenges every assumption about safety and normalcy. Tomorrow morning at 5:45 a.m., the National Guard begins evacuation operations. By this time tomorrow, you'll be in West Yellowstone or Gardner or Jackson, being assessed and processed. By this time next week, you'll be home trying to explain to people who weren't here what tonight felt like. By this time next year, Yellowstone will have reopened with new protocols and new understanding and new respect for what can happen when humans interact with one of the most geologically active places on the planet. The park held, you held, Montana and Wyoming held, and this frequency was here when you needed it, which is what local radio does when everything else is uncertain. At 11:02 p.m., I'm going to keep broadcasting through the night. Marcus is going to keep coordinating. And at 5:45 a.m., when the sun comes up over Yellowstone and the guard begins moving through the park, we're going to broadcast every moment of the evacuation until the last person is out and safe. Hello, listener. Yellowstone is still here. The geysers are still erupting. The bison are still grazing, though some of them need management now. The supervolcano is still patient. And 12,000 people are waiting for dawn in the most beautiful, dangerous place in America. So are we. We'll be here when morning comes.